Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, my name is Miriam Sauer, and I am a host at the New Books Network. Today I am welcoming Dr. Robert Caper, medical doctor, to the psychoanalysis section of the New Books Network. Robert is a U.S.-American psychoanalyst. He has published 4 books, broadly situated within the British tradition. He is based between Vermont and New York City, where he also practices as a psychoanalyst. He is a graduate from Reed College and UCLA School of Medicine and trained at the Psychoanalytic Center of California, which was at that time very much influenced by the presence of Bion, Albert Mason, and James Grotstein. Robert has lectured worldwide. He is a central figure in the U.S. American Kleinian tradition, and he has published his newest book, Bion and Thoughts Too Deep for Words: Psychoanalysis, Suggestion, and the Language of the Unconscious, which came out 4 years ago with Routledge. It has also recently been translated into German, and it is a remarkable study on psychoanalytic work, its relationship to other kinds of psychotherapy, questions of containment, technique, and the work of W.R. Bion. I greatly enjoyed reading Robert's work, which emphasizes the centrality of truth to the psychoanalytic endeavor. Robert, welcome. I'm so happy to get the opportunity to discuss your new work with you and learn from a brilliant scholar and analyst.
Well, thank you, Miriam. I want to say I'm delighted to be here. After being introduced as a brilliant scholar and an analyst, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say.
I think it's more than deserved. You've written a beautiful book, and has stayed with me, and I've discussed it with many friends and colleagues. So I would like to begin this discussion by sort of setting the stage and discuss some of the central assumptions that you make about human interactions throughout the first chapters. So in the beginning of your book, you discuss the tendency of human beings to sync up through something you call song and dance. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, be glad to. The idea of song and dance and human beings syncing up with each other came from basically 2 pieces of laboratory research. The first one was in the 1960s by a man named Condon at the University of Pittsburgh. And he had a setup where he filmed 2 adults conversing with each other and using high-speed cinematography so he could capture movements that were too quick and subtle to be seen by the naked eye often. And what he found was that when someone is speaking, they move their body in subtle ways in relation to their speech.
Mm-hmm.
And the listener does the same thing. And they are unaware of doing this. When he questioned them about it, he showed them they were unaware that they were making these movements. What's particularly interesting about these observations is that it was true even when the listener was 2 days old, that even newborn babies synchronize their bodily movements with the rhythms of speech when they're being spoken to. And this is true, obviously, regardless of what language is being used. It works just as well with Chinese as it does with English. And it's something that doesn't happen in response to rhythmic tapping, and it doesn't happen in response to humans' speech sounds, random sounds. What I mean by that is that he recorded people speaking, and then he took the tape, the physical tape from the recorder, and cut it up into small bits, and then taped the bits back together again in a random order, so that these were human voice sounds, but it was meaningless, had no meaning.
Mm-hmm.
the babies did not respond to that. So there seems to be something other than the semantic content of speech that gets conveyed between humans even as young as 2 days.
Right.
And I said that the babies dance in response to the music of human speech.
Uh-huh. Right. And that has very fundamental implications also for clinical practice. And as you outline, and what I found really interesting is you connect this to some of Bion's reflections about group therapy, which it doesn't so often get picked up. And I was wondering if you could show us what Bion maybe said and also how these two things tie together.
Well, Bion came up with the idea of basic assumption, what he called a basic assumption mentality in groups. Bion found was that in these groups that he conducted, that he led at the Tavistock Institute in London in the middle and late 1940s, that in addition to the sort of rational, real-world, realistic discourse that was going on between the members of the groups, there was an unconscious belief that seemed to be held in common by the members of the group. And he described these in various forms. I think he talked about 3 different types of unconscious belief, but the group behaved as though these beliefs, which were quite fantastic, were true. For example, they would, when confronted with a problem, various people would say various things, but no one would get any attention except Bion.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone else was ignored as though no one knew anything except Bion. So Bion said that the group was behaving as though it had a leader, and he was the leader, and all it had to do was sit back and let the leader solve the problem and address the problems that were facing the group. And he called this the basic assumption dependency. Mm-hmm. And he said leaders seem to be a kind of God, or the only reliable source of information. And he related this in the society at large to the phenomenon of church.
Mm-hmm.
So this was one basic assumption. These ideas were completely unconscious,
mm-hmm.
And yet they were somehow able to enter the group in a way where there was universal unspoken agreement. At other times, the group behaved as though there were an external enemy, and the group's job was to devise a defense to protect itself from the threat from the external enemy. This was also never stated,
mm-hmm.
but the group would sort of drift into these ideas without knowing explicitly what the ideas were, that had a real grip on the group. Mm-hmm. So this seemed to me to be related to Condon's work with infants, in mm-hmm. that there seemed to be some unspoken way of people communicating and synchronizing their ideas mm-hmm. in the same way that babies will synchronize their movements to speech. And I call this song and dance in my book.
Yes, exactly. And I thought this was really brilliant, the way you set this up, and it leads you to a larger critique of something you call supportive psychotherapy, which you juxtapose with psychoanalysis. I think that's like a really central distinction that you draw in this book. And could you explain to us what the difference between these two modalities is, and how they relate to these phenomena?
Well, psychoanalysis has had a very long relationship with suggestion and clinical hypnosis. Freud started his career practicing suggestion. in the manner of his teacher, Bernheim. And well, which was basically using the force of the physician's personality to get the patient to think in a certain way.
Uh-huh.
And he wasn't comfortable doing that. And because he felt it was arbitrary and tyrannical, and it was dominating the patient. And when he heard about Breuer's work, which was basically allowing the patient to reassociate and discuss their anxieties and concerns with the patient, which seemed to make the patient better, he realized that it corresponded to a theory that he had been developing, an armchair psychology about the causes of hysteria.
Mm-hmm.
So he converted his practice to something like Breuer by letting the patient reassociate. But he also has certain theories of his own about what was causing hysteria, and these patients were all hysterics. And he, in subtle ways, guided the patient toward uncovering a forgotten memory or a repressed fantasy that his theory dictated they should have if they had hysteria, the cause of hysteria.
Mm-hmm.
And he felt that he could justify this because it wasn't ordinary suggestion. It was really getting patients to recognize what was causing their problem, and the idea would be if they could have an emotionally fluent recognition of the cause of the problem, and it would become conscious now, whereas it wasn't conscious before, that would cure the patient.
Right.
But he was still basically using suggestion to kind of push the patient. And at one point he would put his hand on the patient's forehead and exert pressure to get them to remember. So, and as we know, eventually he, using this technique, discovered, to his surprise, the phenomenon of transference.
Mm.
And he started investigating the transference, and he realized that there was a certain form of transference, which was positive and affectionate, that he could use to get the patient to remember these things he needed them to remember, which were always painful, by using the positive transference. So what he would do was he would not interpret the positive transference. If the patient had a negative transference toward him, if they didn't like him or they were resisting him, he would interpret that. If the patient had a neurotic transference toward him, which interfered with the work, he would interpret that. But he left the positive transference alone, and he used it to get the patient to do what he wanted them to do. He said at one point, psychoanalysis is a cure through love, and that's often misunderstood to mean that the analyst's love for the patient. That's not what he meant. He meant the patient loves the analyst. And because the patient is really in love with the analyst, the patient will behave like people do when they're in love. They try to please the person they're in love with. So this was still suggestion, though, because he was using the patient's psychology to get the patient to go where he wanted them to go. And he wrote a paper on transference, and he said at the end of the paper that once you get the patient to do all this work and remember everything that his theory said they should remember, then you free them of their attachment to the analyst. And he never said quite how this was done. It seemed like an afterthought. But basically, the idea was to use the positive transference, cultivate the positive transference, establish yourself in the patient's mind as a as a good, helpful figure, someone who was patient tolerant, understanding, interested, everything we always wanted in our lives, to have somebody like that, and use the positive feelings generated by that to get the patient to go in the direction in their associations and to remember, if you want to call it that, what he wanted them to remember. Now, the potential here for, I won't say abuse necessarily, but for, validating one's own theories about the patient is in a kind of abusive way is obvious. Yes. And that's suggestion.
Right.
So Freud, the transference, if he could have studied the transference objectively, he would have, I think, made progress in an area that he failed to make. He didn't take the opportunity. He opened the door toward studying an objective study of the transference, but he didn't really go through it. He didn't really go through it. He used the transference as a tool for suggestion. And that's had a legacy in psychoanalysis because even today, there's a huge debate about how psychoanalysis works and how one should conduct it or what the proper technique is. And it falls broadly into these two categories of people who are using the positive transference to create a certain kind of relationship and to cure the patient through their love for the analyst, and those who will interpret the positive transference along with all the other kind and not privilege it as a kind of proper way to feel.
Right. Yeah, that's a really beautiful reconstruction of this history, and it takes us into one of the central arguments of your book. Right. So we have supportive psychotherapy, as you mentioned it, and then what you consider psychoanalysis. And one of the claims that you then make or that you propose is psychoanalysis is about the truth, and it should not try to cure. Is that right?
Right, not try to cure in the conventional sense of the word.
Right. Could you elaborate on your understanding of cure and truth?
Well, this is really based on Bion's work. Bion pointed out that psychoanalysis is a new activity in human culture. It's not like anything that went before. But people tend to assimilate new ideas by making them seem at first like old ideas. They're easier to digest that way. He said the idea that psychoanalysis is like medical treatment is an example of that. So that psychoanalysis is regarded as like a medical treatment. A medical doctor will take a patient who's in some sort of pain and will do something to make them feel better, to reduce the pain. They can either cure the patient, or if they can't cure the patient, at least they can do something to make the pain less. So he said it was natural that psychoanalysis would be regarded as something like that. But he said it isn't. It's not a treatment in that sense. It's not a cure in that sense. It's only a way of, as he said, holding a mirror up to the patient and hoping they recognize themselves in and that's where truth comes in, because the job of the psychoanalyst is not to shape the patient, not to cure them, not to fix them, not to improve them, but to show them who they are. And whatever use they make of that information is their business, not the analyst's.
Right. Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of putting that. I mean, I think I was very much, I found that both intuitive and thought-provoking when I encountered that line of your argument. And it made me wonder I mean, there's a lot of different folks coming into psychotherapy, different walks of life, different backgrounds. And one of the associations I've had with that is this a modality of therapy, the kind of psychoanalysis you envision, and that bases itself in the Bionian mode? Can this work for someone who is deeply traumatized, who is, very much maybe regrets, or, can that work for them, or would they not require, almost as a preparation, a kind of supportive psychotherapy?
Well, the reason Bion came up with these ideas, one of the reasons he came up with these ideas, is that it did work for very disturbed patients, very regressed patients, patients with serious addictions, with psychosis, when nothing else worked.
Right.
So it's not only does it work, so to speak, it's the only thing he found that works. That if you don't address the patient's state of mind and their thought process and their psychodynamics and what's going on inside them in a straightforward way, if you try to prop them up, so to speak, treat them like invalids and withhold the truth, kind of hold fires, so to speak, with these patients, they know it. And it makes them feel like you're as afraid of who they are as they are. That
And
it's only by speaking the truth, and of course the truth is, I say truth, the analyst's honest opinion. That's as close as you can get. Analysts don't have access to the, divine truth, but they do have opinions and they can express them. So that's what I mean. It seems to me that you are such and such, that you are feeling such and such, that you are afraid of such and such, something like that. If you avoid that, if you walk around that, the patient will know it, and it will make them feel like they can't really trust you to help them.
I see. I feel like this is a nice segue into a second complex of questions which have to do with technique. You've already mentioned that an analyst conveys truths through opinions or interpretations, perhaps, and observations. And so I was wondering, what is your vision for technique? In your book, you also point to a theory of technique which highlights the original Greek meaning of it as techne. Could you further explain this concept?
Sure. The word is from Aristotle, who distinguished three kinds of knowledge. He said the first is knowledge that is what he called fixed and eternal, and it would basically it would correspond to what today we would call the laws of physics or things like that. They're well established. They can be expressed in a very general way. And they're not fixed and eternal, obviously, because they're still evolving. But there's a kind of certainty and generality to the knowledge. And that is applicable to the physical world. We can have that kind of knowledge about the physical world. Another kind of knowledge or another kind of area that Aristotle talked about was things that are completely random and unknowable. Who's going to win the lottery? That sort of thing. Things that no one can ever know. He said, but there's something in the middle, and he called that techne, and he said it is knowledge. You don't know what's going on beforehand. You don't have a general physical theory about something. But you have some idea of what's going on, but you mainly learn about the problem as you try to solve it. And there are no fixed general principles you can use to help you solve the problem, but you kind of chip away at it and you learn what the problem is as you solve it. And the example I use in the book is an architect who's supposed to design a building to fit on a certain location, on a certain site, which has a certain kind of terrain and so on. The building has to have certain uses, certain size, and he doesn't know beforehand what the proper design is. He goes to the site, he walks over the site, he thinks about the uses of the building, he finds out what kind of, and gradually a picture forms in his mind. Not because there's a theory of what to do in the site, because the site is unique. So it's something like that. And in psychoanalysis, we learn, we can see a patient with an initial consultation, and we can say after 2 or 3 meetings, you have an unresolved Oedipus complex. Okay, so you say that to the patient, and they say, well, so what? What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's only when you start the analysis, which has as a guideline, just say whatever comes into your mind, and it's an impossible advice to follow. But what you do is you find out where this person's trying to free associate, and at a certain point, there's something they don't want to go. A certain place they don't want to go. If you find out what those places are as you're in the process of doing the analysis, and that's how you learn about the patient.
Right.
Not because of their Oedipus complex, but because of this patient. Where do they have trouble going?
Right.
And why do they have trouble going there? That's what you learn, and that's the analysis.
And that strikes me very much as a process that is reliant on intuition and on reverie, and of course here we come to the central Bionic concept, which is containment. And in your book, you actually draw a really fascinating distinction between a maternal and a paternal container. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more how these two interact vis-a-vis technique, reverie, and so forth.
Well, the usual model in people's minds, first of all, the concept of container has become very widespread and very popular. But the usual model that people have when they think of container is one that Bion proposed, that runs as follows. There's an infant that has an unbearable state of mind. Bion's example was the baby's afraid it's going to disappear, afraid it's going to exist. Unbearable feeling. Conveys this feeling to the mother somehow. Song and dance, something or other, rapport between mother and baby. The mother picks up that something's going on, and she has this feeling, this dread, and then she does something to it in her mind and realizes, baby's not dying, the baby's just wet, just needs a diaper change. Okay, so, and conveys this back to the infant. The analogy in analysis is the patient talk about something that makes them quite anxious, that they're ashamed of or are frightened of or something like that, and the analyst treats it in a matter-of-fact way. No judgment. It's not good or bad. We're not interested in whether this is a good or a bad thing. We're interested in what it is. What is it? Not is it good or bad. Just what is it? And that's a kind of very reassuring attitude. The patient may be panicked about it or very anxious to talk about it. The analyst doesn't reassure the patient, but just starts talking about whatever it is in a calm, non-judgmental, interested, curious way. And that's containing the patient and conveys conveys this, the analyst conveys their thinking about it in the form of an interpretation that lets the patient know that that's the approach they're taking, that this is not blowing the analyst's mind. This is not causing the analyst to pick up the phone and call the police. This is just something that can be understood and fit it into the patient's life. It has a reason. It's there for a reason. It's not crazy. That's very reassuring. Okay, so that's maternal containment. That's what I call maternal containment. And that's the picture that people have, that the analyst sort of puts up with the feelings that the patient evokes in them in the countertransference, and uses that to deduce the transference and just to describe the transference in a way that's calming and reassuring, so on. Now, you can use this containment if you, as a therapist, you can use this containment to reinforce yourself as a good object.
Mm-hmm.
Look how understanding I am. It doesn't bother me, and so on. And gee, what a terrific guy. That would be using it in the service of suggestion, in the service of supportive therapy. The point is to establish yourself as a certain kind of object, not to inform the patient about themselves necessarily, but to show them what a good container you are. Okay. However, not all patients are grateful for the effort that you're putting in. Some are, but not all patients are grateful. Not all patients are reassured. Some of them resent it, and some of them become, let's say, envious of the analyst who can contain these things that the patient can't. Bion talks about a patient who said that Bion couldn't help him because Bion, the analyst, had not gone through the suffering and the experiences that the patient had. So he can't possibly understand them because he hadn't gone through them himself. Therefore, he can't help the patient. Bion then, through the course of working with the patient, showed him that when the patient did evoke those experiences in Bion in various ways, making him feel frightened, making him feel uncertain, making him feel lost, making him feel all kinds of very difficult emotions, and Bion still remained calm and didn't break down like the patient had in response to those emotions, or to avoid feeling those emotions. Bion was able to tolerate emotions that the patient wasn't. The patient never forgave him for it because it created too much envy. And and this is one example, but it is a not uncommon phenomenon for patients to envy the analyst. And when that happens, they attack the analyst. What I mean is, they try to undermine the analyst's confidence, undermine the analyst's ability to understand things, confuse the analyst, in order to stop them from doing the analysis. Or they may try to involve the analyst through the countertransference in some kind of non-analytic relationship. They will try to undermine the analysis one way or another. For this, you need a different kind of containment. Because if you simply understand the patient and can convey your understanding and your benign attitude and your curiosity and so on, that's only going to make the situation worse. It's going to make them more envious. So you need another kind of container that I call the paternal container, which protects the maternal container from being attacked by the patient. Think of a father who protects the mother from the child's aggression, so that the mother can do the job of containing without having to fight a battle at the same time.
It's like a bodyguard.
Like a bodyguard, yeah. And those are two different functions, but they're both containment. And Bion describes this using a military analogy, and he quotes an army general somewhere in his, I think in his notebooks, where he says this general said, you don't have to have a lot of brains to be a general, but you do have to be able to use whatever brains you've got while you're being shot at and bombed.
Mm-hmm.
That's the paternal containment.
Okay. That's really, that's quite the analogy.
So the paternal container helps, and they're both functions of the analyst's mind, but a paternal container helps the mother be a maternal container while she's being shot at and bombed by the patient.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what I was wondering here is, you described very beautifully this interplay of containers. And you mentioned that attacks on the maternal container are motivated by envy. And I was wondering if you could take us a little bit more into this psychology. So there's envy. Is this also a fear, perhaps, that the maternal container is working so well that the analysand is afraid they might reach certain depths that they are afraid of, so they need to sabotage the relationship? What are your own empirical experiences? What motivates these kinds of attacks?
If the analyst is functioning properly as a maternal container, he is able to think about things that the patient is unable to think about, things that were unthinkable prior to that. This means that this is a two-edged sword for the patient, because it's good to have someone who can think about what you can't think about and can help you think about it. Mm-hmm. But it also raises the question of, okay, if they can go there, what's next? What else are they going to find out about me that I haven't thought about, that I don't know about because I haven't been able to think about it? And that's a problem. So let's not go to, it's great containment. Congratulations. Love it. But no more for now,
But that's also then an attack on the act of seeking truth, right? And supportive psychotherapy kind of cooperates with this fear of a maternal container in a way, preemptively.
I think so, because I think the relationship to truth is different. In supportive psychotherapy, the idea is to set yourself up as someone will be trusted as a guide so that you can guide the patient. And that's more the medical model. That's more, okay, there's a problem. We need to fix it. You, the patient, you're over here. You need to get to there. And then you'd be, okay, so I'm going to move you from here to there. And I'm going to, because you're going to trust me, and you're going to take my advice, you're going to take it to heart. It's a whole different objective.
Right. Absolutely. This strikes me as very essential to your argument. It ties a lot of it together. And it also connects to an argument that you make in the book where you assert that, and has Winnicottian overtones. And I was wondering if we could also speak about your relationship to Winnicott in a bit, but what does it mean that the patient must be allowed to play with the analyst? How can we imagine that?
Early in my career, I was doing child analysis, and a la Melanie Klein. And she had this set up, she had a playroom for her child patients, and there was a box of toys, and there was a basin with running water, and the toys were little wooden figures and trains and string and paper and pens and glue and all that. And that the child would use the toys to act out certain kinds of fantasies. They would create these scenarios and use the toys to express the scenarios. And she wasn't directing the play. She said, if you don't direct the play and just watch the child playing, it's the equivalent of free association. So they don't need to be particularly verbal. All they need to be able to do is to play. And so she was able to analyze children as young as 2.5, 3 years old. not relying on their words because they were playing to show her what their fantasies were. They were trying to show her what their fantasies were. They were just doing it. And she said that's equivalent to adults using language and free association. When you're analyzing adults, when you're an analyst, putting yourself in a position, you are putting yourself in a position where the patient can play with you.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same way a child plays with the toys.
Mm-hmm.
They have scenarios in their mind about what kind of relationship they need to have with you, what kind of person they need you to be, and so on. And they try to shape you and mold you into the form that corresponds to their emotional needs. In other words, they're practicing suggestion on you. And you let them, because it's like being with a child in a playroom. You let them. Melanie Klein, there was only one rule about what the child could and couldn't do in the playroom, and that's they could do anything unless it was dangerous, unless there was danger to me or to the child. Then I draw the line. Same thing with adults. They can do what they want. They can say what they want. They can provoke me any way they want. It's all right as long as it's not. But if they stand up and start getting physical, I draw the line. That hasn't happened yet, thank God, but still, it's very open. So you become a toy in the toy box of the adult patient, an emotional toy, and you see what the fantasy is, what the scenario is, what they seem to want you to be, and why they seem to want you to be that way, and you can use that as a basis for interpretation. And it operates at a level that's somehow deeper than what they can say, because it's what they say and then there's what they do. And my mother used to say actions speak louder than words. So it's a kind of action they have on you, and it's through this mysterious thing called projective identification.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, I find interesting that you clearly ground your analysis in the work of Wilfred Bion. Klein is central to you in one way or another. But there are others, of course. There is also Donald Meltzer, another important figure in the British school. And he says, or you will argue following him, that there needs to be an aesthetic element to psychoanalysis and to its practice. And I was wondering if you could speak to this notion and what that entails.
Well, yeah, I have used Meltzer's ideas. I've been impressed by Meltzer's ideas and his idea about the aesthetic element of the analytic experience. I found to be very important, convincing. For example, if you're a good container in the analytic situation, you make an interpretation, and it's a good interpretation, and you have really contained a situation. The patient, you could say, would appreciate that or admire it or something like that. But really, for the patient, it's beauty. The beautiful, the way the feeling is, that's beautiful. Meltzer's ordinary beautiful mother is a kind of innate preconception of someone somewhere who can contain the baby. The babies are hardwired to expect that, or they don't necessarily have an idea of what it is, but they know it when it happens. They know it when they see it. And the emotional component of that is not, oh, that's nice. Now I understand what you've told me. That's a good interpretation. The emotional experience is an aesthetic experience of beauty. And when I spoke about envy earlier, the envy of the good container, think of it in terms of the kind of envy that is gets elicited by beautiful people. Let's say a movie star. They're the target. I grew up and spent most of my life in Los Angeles, so they're involved in movies. But these people, they're I mean, they bring it on themselves, obviously, and they get well compensated for it, but they're the target of an awful lot of intrusiveness. People want to know
Yeah.
everything about them, and oh well, she's not so great. It's makeup and blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of envy gets directed at them, and the kind of competitiveness that they arouse, and as well as a sense of that's who I want to be. I want to look like her.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of it on that level,
Mm.
a reaction to beauty, you get a better idea of the force behind the envy.
Right. Yeah, that's something I always liked about Meltzer. He brings a kind of particular strain into the British school. Maybe it's a bit more American. I mean, he was American originally. So before we delve into this, I think this is really important. I was wondering if we speak of an ordinary, beautiful mother, this raises the question for me, what kind of room does this post-Bionian psychoanalysis leave for queer couples or single-parent constellations? Can we think of ordinary, beautiful fathers, dads? What do you think?
Well, if we use containment as a model and extrapolate that into parenting, then a male analyst can be a good maternal container. It's not with the gender. It's not really about gender identity.
The relationship. Can he also be an ordinary, beautiful mother?
Yeah, absolutely. And a female analyst can be a very strong, protective guardian.
Right.
And I think Melanie Klein had that quality a lot.
Yeah.
She was kind of no nonsense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, she had to really make her space, make her way in a context that didn't always give her that space. So I can see that.
Yeah, if you think of the strength that must have taken.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I find very significant about Meltzer is he opens something up in the British school, and it's something that made me think about a remark Christopher Bollas once made, and that is that British psychoanalysis can be quite Protestant in its emphasis of suffering over sexuality. And we find this cultural Protestantism, I think, very much in Bion's work, in Winnicott as well, to a certain degree. And so my question is for you, how do you work with sexuality, and how do you view sexuality? Yeah.
Well, you're opposing suffering to sexuality. Or Bollas is opposing.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
I've never seen sexuality without suffering.
Okay.
So,
okay, it's a big claim. Can you say more about that?
I mean, maybe I have. I mean, not in the long run, they go together.
Right.
But when you say sexuality, you're talking about sexual identity, gender identity.
I think that's part of it, but I think I was also just thinking about, I mean, from the French school, Freud himself as well, there's a strong emphasis on sex and the notion that the unconscious is primarily sexual. And so I was wondering, so I think when I look at Bion's work, he tends to, in my reading of him at least, avoid these kinds of questions a little bit, or he doesn't talk about it so much. And so I think that's what I had in mind. Sex itself, so to speak, having sex. Yeah.
I think Bion's take on it was sort of indirect. I mean, when I was talking before about the basic assumptions, he identified three kinds of basic assumptions, and one was oral, the other was fight, flight, faced with an enemy that they have to either escape from or fight. And the third was what he called pairing. And it's no coincidence that those correspond to the oral, anal, and genital stages of Freudian psychosexual development, even though he didn't really talk about Freud's theories of sexuality very much.
Okay. Right.
His main, when he writes about sexuality, it's usually in the context of an anti-sexual superego, and the problem of a superego that doesn't want you to live and doesn't want you to have sex and doesn't want you to thrive. But he tended to speak of it always in connection with living, with being alive. There's a superego that is just against that. The archaic superego.
Right. And I think when I read the post-Bionian tradition, I think aliveness is such a value, such a goal. And it shows up in Ogden, it shows up in other people's work, it shows up in your work as well. What does that mean? What does it mean to be alive? How can we conceive of this? People come to life in the clinic. What do you associate with this goal of aliveness? Is truth enlivening?
It's related to reality. It's related to being in contact with reality. And I mean, both external reality and the internal reality of your own internal world, as opposed to being afraid to do that and having and suffering the impact of this archaic superego. That it seems to be anti-life, and along with envy, in Bion's view, he comes very close. No, he comes more than close. He gets to the point where he says that those are the clinical manifestations of the death instinct. And he's very much involved in the life and death instinct, and that sexuality was subsumed under a more general category of eros, as opposed to, which is the life instinct, as opposed to the death instinct.
Right. Sometimes when I read Bion, I wonder how much he ever really trusted life instincts and if he really believed in it, or because there's an equal tendency, very Kleinian, to emphasize the notion of Thanatos. Thanatos always kind of breathing down your neck, the death, and you are trying to find a response to it.
Well, the Kleinians see the life instinct as associated with growth and development and integration of the personality. That eros brings things together in a very general way. And that the death instinct is something, but to be alive is disturbing. And the death instinct, if you think about Freud's original idea of the pleasure principle, which is to reduce the level of tension and energy and disturbance in the organism down to as close to zero as you can get it. That's the goal of the pleasure principle. That's really being dead. So the death instinct, and when Freud was talking about the pleasure principle, he was talking about an organism that was trying to wind down to zero without recognizing at first that what he was describing was dying. And that living means having disturbance and having tension, and psychological development means increasing your capacity to have disturbances within you and to deal with disturbances without getting disturbed, without falling apart as a result in the process.
Well, that's really good, and that makes me also come to what is the next question, which is, which has to do with Bion's own biography, and again touches upon questions of death, survival. I think I also hear a lot about survival in here, and life, which is his own biography, because he was, I believe, he was a tank walker. You described this briefly in your book, and when we spoke before, once you said to me, Bion really was a British Army general in his demeanor and his comportment. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, and if you think this has had an impact on his own work.
Oh, I think it had a tremendous impact on him. I think that he was enormously traumatized by the whole experience. And he's written a couple of memoirs about his experiences in the First World War, and sitting next to one of his men in a trench who's had his chest blown open, and just sitting with him, listening to him die. And he had terrible guilt about surviving.
Mm-hmm.
But that episode, the tank walker episode you're talking about, he was a 19-year-old captain, and he was in charge of a unit with tanks, and tanks were kind of the new secret weapon at that time. There was, and they were very primitive, and you couldn't see out of them if you were driving the tank, and so you had to have somebody walking in front of you to guide you, and that was the officer. That was Bion, who was walking in front of the tank, and he was directly exposed to enemy fire. If he'd been hit and fell, his tank could easily have run him over and killed him. He was deliberately exposing himself to terrible danger, and he had to do it without panicking. That's
right. And that's also where self-containment comes in, which is a kind of skill that one can develop as well.
Well, the self-containment is different from containment. I think what we're trying to do in analysis is produce self-containment, is to facilitate the patient's developing self-containment, which is different from just having someone you talk to, you're upset, they think about what you're saying, they're calm about it, they're rational about it, they kind of able to think about it clearly. That's good, but eventually you have to learn to do that for yourself. And I don't think you learn to do that for yourself just by having it done for you over and over and over again for years.
Right.
Because, and the analogy I use is you don't become a great dancer or an athlete by watching dancers and athletes perform. You don't you can't contain yourself by having someone else contain you. You have to have a certain appreciation and a certain, it's that feeling that Meltzer talked about, that this is a beautiful thing. And beauty draws you. You want to, if you can produce, if you have an aesthetic sense, a sense of the beautiful, and you can produce it on your own, that's very powerful. And I think something like that is what produces self-containment.
And I think, to me, that really ties it all together, and also to the title of your book, Thoughts Too Deep for Words, which speaks to how words can try to contain even as they fail. And I was wondering, to kind of conclude this interview, perhaps as a final question, is there ever a moment where we have words for all of our thoughts, or will there always be thoughts that are too deep for containment? And how do we live with that?
Well, Bion would say absolutely not.
Right.
Never a moment, because that would be equivalent to not having an unconscious.
Right.
And if you don't have an unconscious, you're not human. Well, you say no. There's always more. There's no shortage of things you're not going to understand or be able to express.
I really like that as a way of concluding this interview. Dear Robert, thank you so much for this interview. I learned a lot.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And yeah, thank you so much, Robert. I learned so much from you today and from reading your wonderful book. My name is Miriam Sauer, and this was a podcast for the New Books Network Psychoanalysis section. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.